Yeah. So this is when we talk about mixing and matching and powers. I'm glad that these two are happening back to back. So as some people may know already, Tullamore Dew was acquired by Powers before the formation of IDL and was brought into IDL with Powers. So IDL was formed by Powers, Jemison and Cork Distillers, but Powers already had absorbed Tullamore Dew. And it's a weird one because essentially in 1948, I believe, Tullamore set up a column still. They started making a blended product and they also started making Irish Mist. And Irish Mist became a much better seller than Tullamore Dew. And the distillery closed in, 1954. And by 1963, they were really focusing on Irish Mist and whiskey. Irish whiskey was in such a dead end. There was more money in the liqueur, and they did a deal with Powers. They said, well, look, if you keep giving us grain whiskey for Irish Mist, you can have the Tullamore Dew brand for whiskey. And it was an amazing. So they were absorbed into each other. So you had DEW Limited, which still carried on for quite some time afterwards and ran other things, grocers, malting interests at one point.
There's a lot of history about that space.
Yeah,
they did a lot. The family.
The family, yeah, and actually their archives are in the National Archives. So a lot of the research I was doing, you can't find anything if you look for Tullamore Distillery, but if you look for DEW Limited, you can see their books. And anyway, this Tullamore 12-year-old is from the Powers ownership era. So despite being Tullamore Dew, this is much likelier to be John's Lane distillate than the Powers we just had. The other could have had some knocking about, but this was made under the watchful eye of John's Lane Distillery. Wow. And
I can smell it from here.
Yeah, so we may actually be drinking.
Super.
It's a weird, and you can always tell them because it suddenly says like Tullamore Dew Whiskey Dublin, on the crocks. But of course, it's also a 12-year-old, so they could be bringing stuff in from the old distillery. There's again a lot of confusion. Now that the panel's met, I'm at great liberty to talk about mash bills, so we'll go through a few of them. Okay. But Tullamore Distillery ran a mash of about, say, 30 to 35, or let's say 35% malt content, lower malt than Dublin, a tiny smidgen of rye, a little bit more wheat, about 15% oats, and then the rest is raw barley. And that was their pot still. And at the same time, rye was always only kind of a flavouring ingredient in Irish pots, very small rye content for most of them. And it was the first to drop off in the 20th century, the first to disappear. But Tullamore seemed to have kept it on right until they closed down the shop. But what's interesting is if you look at their branding material, they also say that they make a special all malt product for blending purposes. So when they started making blends, they weren't blending in the pot still, they were distilling malt whiskey in Tullamore for the purpose, because blended Scotch was the hallmark of what a blend should be. So they were making malt on purpose for the privilege of blending it down. So that could be in there as well. Who knows? Or it could all just be Powers. Meanwhile, Powers, when they were making grain whiskey, they were running barley through it because that's what they had, and they were making a barley-based grain in the late years, just again before Middleton. So there's who knows what is in here, but it is far likelier to be.
But it's not from Tullamore.
Well, they absorbed.
So
they absorbed stock from B. Daly on condition that they would make grain distillate for Irish Mist, but there was no money in the pots, so there could be Tullamore knocking about, but there's a lot of chances.
So the chances are it could be, potentially at this point, because we know when the crocks are made, that it could be.
Yeah, it is most likely, to be honest, it's most likely John's Lane grain and a mix of the two. It smells a lot more like B. Daly than it does. Although it's still, when I talk about like old distilleries, like old pot still Powers, the reference point we were just discussing, you're talking back of the shed, workshop, resin, apricot, leather, that kind of stuff. Whereas B. Daly tastes much more herbal. It's almost like rosemary, cloves, persimmon, even this like sharper kind of tint. Yeah. And again, then my mind just starts playing tricks on me. I'm like, oh, is that a Tullamore? Is that a B. Daly or is that a John's Lane?
It's a beast of a colour.
I know, yeah, my God.
Like the colour on it is like absolutely fantastic. And for those that have got black glasses, God love you, you can't see it. But
and it's strange. To be honest, if I was to take a bet, and I want it to be a Powers because I love Powers, but there is that clove kind of crispness at the back, and that to me screams B. Daly, much more than the old Powers juice. But then you also, again, mind playing tricks. You have that weird, like, how would you put it? Like, again, fuzz, as it were, that warmth, that more peach than apricot kind of feeling. But it becomes, this space in Irish whiskey history is so interesting because...
What caskings are being used here? Because this is interesting, because I suppose we're at that period, is it bourbon casks? Because is it more likely to be sherry caskings?
To be honest, a lot of it...
What is that?
A lot of the casks were just aged in the whiskey itself. The Power season casks.
Just constantly seasoning in its own stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of... I've been through... actually, one of the oddest finds I found was B. Daly's cask sourcing program. And it was fascinating because we always think, there was sherry, and then in the later half of the 20th century, bourbon came on tap. And you're looking at this menu. It's a company in England that's selling them casks, and they have price points. And you're looking at rum, you're looking at port, you're looking at sherry, you're looking at chestnut, which of course has recently reared its head as well, and all that is there. So again, and then the casks themselves were quite Frankenstein. I mean, you look. Even one of the most interesting resources I went through, Peter Dunn over at Mitchell & Son lent me their books, and it's from the sherry perspective. And you look at what sherry was up until relatively recently, and when they were getting the stuff in cask, you get a sherry, so that's a bit dry. Take a bit of port in there, see what happens. These casks themselves were kind of Frankensteins even before the whiskey got to them. So when we saw, people often ask me, like, was Yellow Spot really a Malaga cask? Was it this? Was it that? That wasn't even the logic of the time. The whole history was about doctoring cask by cask to keep it, and it was seen as a quality thing, to keep everything worth the customer's time. So there's reference to Malaga. Does Malaga not?
I'm just curious on colour, because, I mean, I've come across many Scotch whiskies that could have been, they're in bourbon casks, they've said so, and yet they're pale as straw 20 years, 30 years later. So this is 12 years old, but it's got colour, which it's deep. It's deep in colour.
A deep colour. Doesn't taste too sherry, but again, like the wood was so, wood started being taken seriously in the 80s. And so the distillate is heavier, the wood is weaker, and there's so many of these flavours you get. Again, like looking back at when I think of Jameson, Bow Street pot still, I think of like citrus, orange peel, that kind of stuff. You look at B. Daly and think clove, but then you wonder, like, there's so little reference points. Is that clove really to do with B. Daly, or is it to do with the casks? So much has changed. Is it to do with the mash? But none of these things exist in raw space. But there are these wonderful, and in the same way that like the Powers taste, that apricot-y thing, and that leather has, even in a lighter, more vanillin-dependent incarnation in the modern blend, been around. I think that's why John's Lane was such a fan favorite almost at birth, because it reminded a lot of people of these kind of classic tastes. But then you taste something like this. These are flavors that have, in my mind, actually disappeared. That clover thing. The Paddy will have it as well. There's this weird, like, pale clover. I've never eaten belt, but I have eaten foliage as a child. Plenty of clovers and grass and things. But that weird, again, persimmon is another big thing I think of, when I think of B. Daly. It was a bit sharper, a bit more resinous. You remember last year when we had that Napog, and that had the persimmon in spades. That more like spice rack flavor pot still mixed with that clover. The cork distillers also tasted like clover. But all these flavors have vanished, and you're wondering, are they being vatted together? Is this, again, my mind playing tricks? But whatever it is.
We've got a comment here, and two people have kind of sided with it, saying that the first thing that hit it was on the tongue. It was the first sip, and it was pure sweetness, akin or almost like a rum. That sweetness on the tongue.
Well, they were buying rum casks in spades, and that was in that. And that documentation, bizarrely enough, and if anyone wants to find this stuff, it takes 5 minutes to get a library card. National Library has all the Locks records. National Archives. Look up DW.
You having to dig at all those journals out there and all those historians that haven't bored their hole beforehand? Get a library card, guys.
But the Locks somehow, and in the same way that like Kilbeggan have the old B. Daly stills sitting in Kilbeggan, somehow some random, I have no idea why, they were never the same company, B. Daly material turned up in the Locks archives, and it was B. Daly's. And I sent it on to John Quinn and Kevin, and I think Tim was still working for Tullamore, so I sent the three of them. This stuff, and it was such a reveal because it was showing the diversity of casts that were being bought, and and how much richer it was than we had thought. Yeah. And yeah, they were definitely rum barrels were coming into Tullamore.
Guys, what are you making on this one for the taste? Are we liking it as much as the previous one? What's
I think the smell is very complex. Every time you go back to it, there's a real floor, sawdust, licorice, different things. The taste, I think, is quite flat. Not a huge amount. I think it's just because of the powers. It's kills me a bit.
It's a weird, and when I say rum casks are coming into Tullamore, I should qualify again. This is during the John's Lane ownership, so we don't even know if it was and what was left of what policy. But there is that weird, when you taste it, there's a weird flavour. I mean, some of the very expensive Middletons that were from Cork distillers, Dungorney and these, are coming from the old Middleton distillery, and there's this weird whiter shade of pale flavour. It's really pale clover. It's not a pot still flavour that I think exists anymore. But Tullamore had it as well. Never really saw it in Powers. But again, it's here, definitely. And it's not the most exciting flavour. It's not, the kind of bristle that some of them have. It's not the big oily Powers flavour. It's not the sharp citrine Jameson. But it's fun, and it's gone now. It's not there.
Do you know what I noticed? There was a couple of auctions, not whiskey auctions by the way, but a couple of just auctions selling ceramics, used ceramics, and these crocks that they came in are selling close to £100 without the liquid.
Yeah. It's right when you swallow, by the way. That feeling, that clover and cream flavour. It's almost waxy. It's like if you. I remember when I was a kid, The Simpsons, there was one where Homer is trying to eat chili, very, very spicy chili, and he swallows liquid wax so he doesn't have to taste the chili and he can cheat at the competition. And I always remember wondering what that flavor, but it's that weird liquid. It's almost like you've coated your mouth in some sort of wax,
yes.
and you're drinking whiskey through that, But it's fun and it's different, and it's not. And again, there is the curiosity as to what it was. I mean, Tullamore do love to advertise now that they're a triple blend, but that itself has precedence because, and again, purely for competitive reasons, seemingly, that they felt obliged when they started making blends to blend malt and grain together rather than pot still. And the fact that they kept making pot still on its own and then malt for the purposes of blending with grain, is peculiar. And where did those stocks go after the takeover? And is it just a coincidence that happened? And then when IDL formed and there was the organization of how different products would be made, it was Paddy and Tullamore Dew that were earmarked to have a malt content, So who knows? Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe there's a continuance there of an idea of how to put these flavors together. And then you get this, again, liminal space in the middle where we just don't know. And it's 12 years old, so it's 12 years older than its era. And that's a very important thing I found with trying to research the mashes of these, because you always have to go back 12 years from the date to know what the distillate was, and you're always forecasting. So most of the stuff that was made in the 60s becomes blends in the 70s, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Jameson. Should we crack on to the Jameson?